Sometimes a man loses everything before he finds what he was truly meant to be. Buck Tillman was 67 when the bank took his ranch and every piece of pride he had. With nothing but shame, he rode into the Rockies to his grandfather's forgotten barn. Half-rotted, abandoned, waiting, Buck rebuilt it with raw hands into something unexpected, a sanctuary for the broken. Runaways, battered women, men with nowhere to go. Word spread. There was a cowboy preacher up the mountain with a pistol and mercy in his eyes. But when old enemies come calling, will his refuge become a battleground? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from right now. And if this story touches your heart or speaks to you in any way, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you that you won't want to miss. The morning the bank came, Buck Tillman stood on the porch of the ranch house his father built and watched 3 vehicles roll up the dirt road. 2 trucks and a sedan, all of them clean and official, kicking up dust that hung in the autumn air like a judgment. He'd known they were coming. The certified letters had been arriving for months, each one more insistent than the last. Each one a reminder of choices made and prices unpaid. Buck was a tall man, still lean at 67, with shoulders that hadn't quite learned to stoop despite the weight they'd carried. His face was weathered leather, lined deep around the eyes and mouth, the kind of lines that came from squinting into too many sunrises and forcing smiles through too many disappointments. His hands, resting on the porch rail, were thick and scarred, the knuckles swollen from decades of work that had, in the end, amounted to nothing. The lead banker was a young man named Peterson, couldn't have been more than 35, wearing a suit that looked wrong against the backdrop of pine and prairie. He approached with a clipboard and an expression Buck recognized, the carefully practiced neutrality of someone who'd been trained to deliver bad news without absorbing any of it. "Mr. Tillman," Peterson said, stopping at the base of the porch steps. "I think you know why we're here." Buck nodded slowly. Behind Peterson, 2 other men waited by the trucks. One of them was taking pictures. The other was already making notes on a tablet, cataloging what would soon belong to someone else. "Give me an hour," Buck said. His voice was quiet, steady. "Let me gather my things." Peterson checked his watch, a gesture that made Buck's jaw tighten. "We can do that. But, Mr. Tillman, I need to be clear. Anything that was listed as collateral needs to stay. That includes the livestock, the equipment, and any—" "I know what it includes." Buck turned and walked into the house before the banker could finish. Inside, the ranch house was spare and clean. Buck had lived alone since his wife Ellen passed 8 years ago. Cancer had taken her slow, given them time to say goodbye, but the house had felt empty ever since. Their daughter Sarah had moved to Denver years before, married a lawyer named Marcus, and visited maybe twice a year. Each visit was pleasant enough, but there was always a distance there, a gap Buck had never quite figured how to bridge. Sarah had wanted him to sell the ranch after Ellen died, move closer to the city. He'd refused. Now the choice had been made for him. He moved through the rooms with purpose, taking only what mattered. From the bedroom, he pulled an old canvas duffel bag from the closet and filled it with clothes, work shirts, denim, a heavy coat. From the dresser drawer, he took the small wooden box that held Ellen's wedding ring and a few photographs. Their wedding day, Sarah as a baby, Ellen on horseback, laughing at something he'd said, the sunlight catching her hair. In the living room, he paused in front of the stone fireplace. Above the mantel hung a photograph of his grandfather, Silas Tillman, standing in front of a timber barn somewhere high in the Rockies. The old man wore suspenders and a hat pushed back on his head, and even through the faded sepia you could see the strength in him. Buck reached up and took the photograph down, studied it for a long moment. Silas had been a logger, spent 30 years working timber camps in the high country before he retired. He'd built that barn with his own hands, used it as a base camp during the logging seasons. Buck had only been there once, as a boy of maybe 10 or 11. His father had taken him up the mountain on horseback, a 2-day ride through country so wild it felt like they'd left the world behind. The barn had seemed enormous to young Buck, Massive beams and rough-cut lumber, the smell of pine pitch and old smoke. Silas had shown him how to split shingles, how to read the grain in a piece of timber, how to know if a tree would fall true. "A man builds something that lasts," Silas had said, his hand on Buck's shoulder. "That's how you measure a life. Not by what you take, but by what you leave standing." Buck set the photograph in the duffel bag and reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the pocket watch. Silas's watch, passed down when the old man died. Buck pulled it out, held it in his palm. The silver casing was tarnished, the crystal face scratched, and the hands had stopped at 3:47. That was the time Silas passed, sitting in his chair on the porch of the cabin he'd built near that barn. "Heart just stopped," the doctor said. "Peaceful." Buck had tried to get the watch repaired once, but the jeweler said the mechanism was too far gone, and Buck had decided to leave it as it was. Some things were meant to stay broken, to mark a moment. He slipped the watch back in his pocket and continued through the house. In the kitchen, he took a cast-iron skillet Ellen had used for 40 years and wrapped it in newspaper. From the pantry, he grabbed a bag of coffee and some canned goods. Not much, but enough to get by. He thought about taking more, but what was the point? He wasn't going somewhere that required much. The last thing he did was go to the gun cabinet in the hall. Inside was his Winchester rifle, a Remington shotgun, and a Colt revolver that had been his father's. He took the Colt, checked the cylinder out of habit, and slipped it into his belt. The rifles he left. Let the bank have them, or whoever came after. He had no use for them anymore. When he stepped back onto the porch, the hour had passed. Peterson was waiting by his sedan, talking into his phone. The other two men had moved closer to the barn, still taking inventory. Buck descended the steps with his duffel slung over his shoulder and his bedroll under his arm. "That's it?" Peterson asked, gesturing to the bag. "That's it," Buck said. "And your vehicle?" "Trucks included in the collateral." Buck nodded toward the old Ford parked near the barn. "I'll be taking the horse." Peterson blinked. "The horse?" "The mare wasn't listed." "She's mine." Buck walked past him toward the corral where a bay mare stood watching. Her name was Darla, and she was 15 years old, steady and sure-footed. Buck had raised her from a filly. "Mr. Tillman, I don't think—" "Check your paperwork," Buck said without turning around. "The livestock that was collateral is in the barn. This horse is mine." He heard Peterson making a call, heard the murmur of conversation, but Buck didn't wait for permission. He saddled Darla with practiced efficiency, tied his duffel and bedroll behind the saddle, and swung up onto her back. The mare shifted beneath him, sensing his mood. Peterson ended his call and walked over. "All right, you're clear on the horse. But, Mr. Tillman, where are you going? Do you have family? Somewhere to stay?" Buck looked down at the banker. The young man probably meant well. That made it worse somehow. "I appreciate your concern," he said, "but I'll manage. There are resources," Peterson continued. "Programs for—" "I said I'll manage." Buck touched his heels to Darla's flanks, and she moved forward. He rode past the barn, past the pastures he'd mended 100 times, past the creek where he'd taught Sarah to fish. He didn't look back at the house. There was no point in that either. The ride into town took 2 hours. Buck kept Darla at an easy walk, letting her set the pace. The day was clear and cool, the kind of autumn day that usually lifted his spirits. Not today. Today, it just felt like the world moving on, without asking his permission. Redemption, Montana, was the kind of town that had been dying for 50 years, but hadn't quite figured it out yet. Main Street had more empty storefronts than full ones, and half the buildings looked like they were held up by habit rather than structural integrity. The hardware store was still there, run by Ed Parsons, who'd been a year behind Buck in school. The diner was open, run by a woman named Louisa, who made the best biscuits in the county. The bar was definitely open. It was always open. Buck rode past the bank, different bank, not the one that had taken his ranch, and past the post office. He stopped in front of the general store and tied Darla to the hitching post that someone had installed as a tourist attraction back in the 80s. Inside, he bought supplies, more coffee, beans, rice, flour, salt, matches, and a new whetstone for his knife. The clerk was a teenage girl he didn't recognize. She looked at him curiously, but didn't ask questions. His next stop was Ed's hardware store. Ed was behind the counter reading a newspaper spread across the glass case that held pocket knives and ammunition. He looked up when Buck entered, and his expression shifted. Surprise, then sympathy, then discomfort. Buck, Ed said, folding the newspaper. Heard about the ranch. I'm sorry. Appreciate it. Buck moved down the aisle, selecting what he needed. Nails, a new hammer, saw blades, a coil of rope, wire cutters. He set everything on the counter. Ed rang it up slowly, glancing at Buck every few items. You got somewhere to land? I'm working on it. You know, Carol and I, we got the spare room if you need. I'm fine, Ed, but thank you. Ed bagged the supplies in silence, took Buck's cash, and counted out change. As Buck turned to leave, Ed called after him. Buck, that barn your grandfather built up near Timber Ridge, it's still standing, far as I know. Saw it maybe 5 years back when I was up hunting. Roof's probably gone to hell, but the bones looked solid. Buck paused at the door, turned back. You remember how to get there? Not exactly. But if you head up the old logging road past Miller's Creek, it's maybe 15 miles in. You'll know the area. There's a lightning-struck pine that's been dead for 20 years, stands alone in a meadow. The barn's about a mile past that, up near the tree line. Buck nodded. Much obliged. Outside, he loaded the supplies onto Darla and stood for a moment in the afternoon sun. People passed on the sidewalk, some nodding to him, others looking away. He wondered how many of them knew. Probably most. Small towns didn't keep secrets well. He stopped at the diner because he hadn't eaten and wasn't sure when he'd have a proper meal again. Louisa sat him at a corner booth and brought coffee without asking. She was a compact woman in her 60s, grey hair pulled back in a bun, eyes that missed nothing. The usual? She asked, please. She returned 10 minutes later with a plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. She set it down and slid into the booth across from him, which surprised him. You leave in town? She asked. Buck cut into the meatloaf. Planning on it. Good. Town's got nothing for you now but pity, and you don't need that. She leaned forward. Buck Tillman, I've known you since we were kids. You're too damn proud to ask for help, so I'm not going to offer it. But I will say this. You're a good man who got dealt a bad hand. That doesn't change what you are. Buck looked up from his plate, met her eyes. I appreciate that, Louisa. Where you headed? He hesitated, then said, my grandfather's place. Up in the high country, she nodded. That's a hard ride this time of year. Winter comes early up there, I know. Then I guess you better eat up. She stood, patted his shoulder once, and went back to the kitchen. Buck finished his meal, left money on the table with a generous tip, and walked out into the fading afternoon. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He untied Darla, swung into the saddle, and rode west out of Redemption without looking back. The logging road Ed mentioned was overgrown, but still passable. Buck found it just past Miller's Creek and turned Darla onto it. The road climbed steadily, winding through pine forest that grew denser as they ascended. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying the scent of approaching winter. He rode until dark, then made camp in a clearing beside the road. He built a small fire, made coffee, and ate beans straight from the can. Darla grazed nearby, her hobbles clinking softly. The night was full of sounds. Wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the crack and pop of the fire. Buck sat wrapped in his coat, the Colt resting on his lap, and stared into the flames. In his pocket, Silas's watch was a weight against his chest, the hand still stopped at 3:47. Buck pulled it out, turned it over in his hands. On the back there were initials engraved, ST, and beneath that a single word, Builder. A man builds something that lasts, Buck whispered to the fire. That's how you measure a life. Tomorrow he would find the barn, and then he would see what was left to build. Buck found the barn on the second day, just as Ed had described. The lightning-struck pine stood like a sentinel in a meadow, gone golden with autumn grass. And beyond it, up a steep trail that Darla navigated with careful steps, the barn emerged from the trees. It was larger than Buck remembered, or perhaps he had just been smaller. The structure was maybe 60 feet long and 40 wide. built from massive Douglas fir logs that had weathered to silver grey. The roof sagged in the middle, and several of the shake shingles had blown away, leaving gaps that let the sky through. The main doors hung crooked on their iron hinges, and the windows, just narrow slits high up on the walls, were dark and empty. But Ed had been right. The bones were solid. The foundation stones were still in place. The main support beams still stood true, and the log walls, though weathered, showed no signs of rot. Silas had built well. Buck dismounted and stood looking at the barn for a long time. Behind it, the mountain rose sharply, pine forest giving way to bare rock and snow-covered peaks. In front, the land sloped down toward a meadow where a creek ran, its water clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from above. The location was perfect, protected from the worst of the wind, with water and timber close by, and far enough from any road that the world couldn't find you unless you wanted to be found. He spent the rest of that day just assessing the damage. The roof needed the most work. At least a third of the shingles would need replacing, and 2 of the support beams had started to crack. The doors could be repaired, rehung properly. The interior was mostly empty, just dirt floor and shadows, with the remnants of old bunks built along one wall, and a stone fireplace at the far end. Animals had been living here, deer probably, and smaller creatures. Their droppings littered the floor. That first night, Buck slept under the stars rather than in the barn. He wasn't ready yet to claim it. The next morning he began. The work was hard and solitary, which suited him. He started with the roof, cutting new shingles from fallen timber he found in the forest. His hands remembered the work his grandfather had taught him all those years ago. Split the wood along the grain, trim it to size, overlap each shingle so the rain would run off rather than seep through. It was slow, methodical work, and his body protested. At 67, he wasn't built for climbing up and down a ladder all day, but he pushed through the aches. Days blended into each other. Buck established a routine: wake before dawn, work until midday, rest during the hottest part of the afternoon, work until dark. He repaired the doors, replaced the broken windows with salvaged glass he'd brought from town on a second trip, chinked the gaps between logs with mud and moss. He rebuilt the bunks and cleaned out the fireplace, discovering that the chimney was still sound. 3 weeks passed before he allowed himself to sleep inside. By then, the barn was weather-tight, warm, and surprisingly comfortable. He'd built a simple stove from an old barrel, vented it through a hole he'd cut in the wall. At night, with the fire going and Darla stabled in the corner he'd partitioned off, the barn felt almost like home. But Buck wasn't building a home. He was building a hiding place. A place where the world couldn't find him, couldn't judge him, couldn't offer its pity or its contempt. He spoke to no one but Darla, and she was a patient listener. He worked, he ate, he slept. That was enough, until the morning he found the boy. Buck had ridden down to the creek to check his snares. He'd been catching rabbits, supplementing his dwindling supplies, when he noticed boot prints in the mud near the water. Fresh prints, maybe a day old. Size small, probably a woman or a young person. They led up toward the barn. His hand went to the colt on his hip as he rode back up the trail. He'd seen no smoke from the chimney, no sign of occupation, but someone had been here. He dismounted quietly, tied Darla to a tree, and approached the barn on foot. The main door was ajar, just slightly. Buck eased it open. The colt drawn now, his eyes adjusting to the dimness inside. The boy was maybe 16, curled up in one of the bunks Buck had built. Wrapped in a blanket that wasn't Buck's, he was asleep or appeared to be. Thin, with dark hair and dirt-smudged face, wearing clothes too light for the mountains, Buck holstered the colt and cleared his throat. "You picked a hell of a place to take a nap." The boy jerked awake, scrambled back against the wall, eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry, I didn't. I'll go easy." Buck held up his hands. "I'm not going to hurt you, but I would like to know what you're doing in my barn." The boy's eyes darted to the door, calculating. Buck could see him weighing his chances of running. "I got lost," the boy said finally. "I was hiking and got turned around. I saw the barn and figured I'd rest until morning." "You're lying." Buck crossed his arms. No hiker comes up here without proper gear, and you're not dressed for the weather. You ran away from somewhere." The boy's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. Buck studied him for a moment. The kid was scared, exhausted, and clearly in over his head. But there was something else in his eyes, defiance maybe, or determination. He reminded Buck of someone, though he couldn't place who. "When's the last time you ate?" Buck asked. The boy hesitated. "Yesterday morning." "Come on then." Buck turned and walked toward the stove. "I've got beans and coffee. Not much, but it'll keep you alive." While the beans heated, Buck made coffee and watched the boy from the corner of his eye. The kid had relaxed slightly, but his body was still tense, ready to bolt. On the bunk where he'd been sleeping, Buck noticed something, a small book with a worn cover. He walked over and picked it up. A Bible, old and tattered, the pages yellowed and loose. The cover was inscribed, "To Thomas from Mom. Love never fails. This yours?" Buck asked. The boy, Thomas apparently, nodded. "Your mother give it to you?" "Before she died." The boy's voice was flat, empty of emotion. 3 years ago." Buck set the Bible carefully on the bunk. "I'm sorry for your loss." They ate in silence. Buck didn't push for information, and the boy didn't offer any. When they finished, Buck poured more coffee and sat on the opposite bunk. "I'm going to tell you something," Buck said, "and I want you to listen. This barn isn't a place for people. It's not a shelter or a hostel. I came here to be alone, and that's what I intend to stay. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I'm not going to turn you out in the cold. You can stay tonight. Tomorrow, I'll take you down the mountain to town, and we'll figure out where you belong." "I don't belong anywhere," Thomas said quietly. "Everyone belongs somewhere. Not me." The boy looked up, and Buck saw the depth of pain in his eyes. "My foster dad, he hit me. Every day, for things I didn't do. I couldn't take it anymore, so I ran. If you take me back, they'll send me back to him." Buck felt something shift in his chest. He knew that look, that desperation. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough over the past months. "There are people who can help. Social workers, police, they don't believe me. They believe him. He's a deacon at the church. Everyone loves him." Thomas's hands shook as he set down his cup. "Please, just let me stay a few days. I'll work. I'll help you with whatever needs doing. I won't be any trouble." Buck wanted to say no, wanted to explain that he'd come here to escape, not to take on someone else's problems. But the Bible on the bunk caught his eye. "Love never fails," it said. A mother's words to her son before the world took her away and left him alone. 3 days, Buck heard himself say. "You can stay 3 days. Then we figure out what comes next." Thomas's expression flooded with relief. "Thank you. I promise I..." "Don't promise anything." Buck stood. "Just rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." That night, Buck lay in his bunk and listened to the sound of the boys breathing across the barn. He'd come here for solitude, for peace, for escape. Now he had a runaway kid sleeping 10 feet away, and all the complications that came with it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Silas's watch. 3:47. Time stopped, frozen at the moment of his grandfather's death. Buck wondered what Silas would have done in his place. The old man had been hard but fair, a man who believed in responsibility and duty. "A man builds something that lasts," Buck whispered to the darkness. Maybe this was the start of something he hadn't planned. Or maybe it was just 3 days, and then the boy would be gone, and Buck could return to his solitude. He didn't know which he hoped for. The 3 days stretched into a week. Buck didn't mention it, and Thomas didn't ask. The boy made himself useful, which Buck grudgingly appreciated. He fetched water from the creek without being told, kept the fire going, and cleaned the barn with the kind of thorough attention that suggested he was trying to prove his worth. On the 4th morning, Buck pulled out a wooden toolbox from behind his bunk. It was made of oak, the corners reinforced with brass, and the lid was inscribed with initials. ST inside were the tools Silas had used when he built the barn. Chisels with worn handles, a hand plane that still held an edge, a folding ruler marked with pencil notations, a square that had measured 1,000 cuts. Thomas watched as Buck laid the tools out on the workbench he'd constructed near the window. "Those are beautiful," the boy said. "They're old," Buck replied. "But they work. My grandfather always said a good tool lasts longer than the man who uses it, if you take care of it properly. He picked up the plane, tested its blade with his thumb. You ever work with wood? Thomas shook his head. Never really had the chance. Well, you're going to learn. Buck gestured toward the corner of the barn, where he'd been planning to build storage shelves. We need shelving. Can't keep living out of bags and boxes. I'll show you how to measure and cut. Pay attention. He spent the next hour teaching Thomas the basics. How to measure twice and cut once. How to mark a line that would stay true. How to let the saw do the work rather than forcing it. The boy was clumsy at first, his cuts uneven, but he listened carefully and didn't make excuses when he made mistakes. Why are you helping me? Thomas asked as they worked. You said you came here to be alone. Buck ran the plane along a board, shaving off thin curls of wood. I did, still true. But you're here, and I don't see the point in both of us being useless. He glanced at the boy. Besides, a man should know how to build something. It's a skill that'll serve you no matter where you end up. They worked through the morning, the barn filling with the smell of fresh-cut pine. Buck found himself relaxing into the rhythm of it, the familiar motions, the satisfaction of watching rough lumber transform into something purposeful. Thomas asked questions, good ones, about why you cut with the grain instead of against it, how to tell if a board was properly seasoned, why certain joints were stronger than others. My grandfather built this barn, Buck said during a break, pouring coffee for both of them. Took him 2 summers, working mostly alone. Every beam, every joint, all by hand. When I was your age, maybe a little younger, he brought me up here and showed me how he'd done it. I remember thinking it was impossible, all that work for one building that nobody but him would ever see. What did he say? Thomas asked. Buck smiled slightly. He said that whether anyone saw it or not didn't matter. What mattered was that it was built right, built to last. He said, a man who builds something solid puts a piece of himself into it, and that piece outlives him. Makes him part of the world in a way that can't be undone. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Do you believe that? I'm starting to. Buck set down his cup. Come on, let's get those shelves finished before dark. By evening, they'd completed one set of shelves and started on another. Thomas's cuts were cleaner now, his measurements more precise. Buck watched him work and saw something shifting in the boy, a kind of focus, a pride in doing something well. It reminded Buck of himself at that age, learning from his father, discovering that his hands could create instead of just consume. That night, after they'd eaten, and Thomas had gone to wash up at the creek, Buck sat alone by the fire and examined Silas's tools. Each one bore the marks of use, handles worn smooth by his grandfather's grip, blades honed and rehoned until they'd thinned. These tools had built not just this barn, but dozens of structures across the high country. They'd provided Silas with purpose, with livelihood, with a way to make his mark on the world. Buck picked up the folding ruler and extended it, reading the pencil notations Silas had made. Measurements for door frames, for window heights, for the spacing of floor joists. The old man's handwriting was small and precise, the numbers marked in a carpenter's shorthand that Buck had learned to read as a boy. When Thomas returned, Buck was still holding the ruler. You keep looking at those tools like they're treasure, Thomas observed, sitting on his bunk. In a way, they are. Buck folded the ruler carefully. My grandfather used these to build a life. Not a wealthy life, but an honest one. He worked until his body gave out, and even then he kept going. The day he died, he was sitting on his porch, looking at this barn. Just stopped breathing, peaceful as you please. You were close to him. Close as I could be, given the distance and the years. But he taught me things I needed to know, things I forgot for a while. Buck set the ruler back in the box. He used to say that every man needs something to build toward. Could be a house, could be a family, could be just a skill you get better at every day. But you need something. Thomas pulled his Bible from under his pillow, ran his fingers over the worn cover. My mom used to say something like that. She said everyone's building something, even if they don't realize it. Either you're building something good, or you're tearing something down. But you're never just standing still. Smart woman, your mother, she was. Thomas opened the Bible, touched the inscription. She was working 2 jobs to keep us fed. Got pneumonia one winter and just never recovered. I was 13. After she died, I bounced around between relatives who didn't really want me. Eventually ended up in foster care. He closed the book. I stopped building anything then. Just survived. Buck understood that. He'd been doing the same thing these past months, surviving, not living. Just going through motions until something gave out. "What do you want to build now?" he asked. Thomas looked around the barn, at the shelves they'd made, at the fire burning steady, at the space that had become, however temporarily, a kind of home. "I don't know yet, but being here learning this stuff, it feels like maybe I could figure it out. Maybe you could." Buck stood, stretched his back. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we finish those shelves and start on repairs to the north wall. I noticed some gaps that'll let the cold in once winter really hits." "Buck?" Thomas said as Buck turned toward his bunk. "Thank you for letting me stay, for teaching me." Buck nodded once. "Just don't make me regret it." But as he lay down and pulled his blanket up, Buck knew that wasn't really his concern anymore. The boy was here, and that meant Buck had a responsibility, not just to keep him safe and fed, but to show him what it meant to build something that mattered. Silas would have expected nothing less. He reached for the pocket watch in his jacket, held it in the darkness. 3:47. Time had stopped for Silas, but maybe, Buck thought, it didn't have to stay stopped for everyone. Maybe there was still time to build something that would last. Winter came early to the high country, just as Louisa had predicted. The first serious snow arrived in mid-October, 6 inches overnight that turned the world white and silent. Buck and Thomas spent the day reinforcing the barn, making sure every gap was sealed, every window secure. They'd built up a good supply of firewood, stacked against the north wall under a tarp, enough to last through spring, if they were careful. The second visitor arrived on a grey afternoon 2 weeks later. Buck was outside splitting wood when he heard the sound. Branches breaking, someone moving through the forest without much concern for stealth. He set down his axe and called to Thomas, who was inside working on a chair he'd designed himself. "Someone's coming. Stay inside." Buck walked to the edge of the clearing, his hand near the colt. A figure emerged from the trees, and Buck relaxed slightly. Not a threat, or at least not an immediate one. The man was maybe 40, tall and gaunt, with a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. He wore a military surplus jacket and boots that had seen better days. He stopped when he saw Buck, held up his hands. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man said. His voice was rough, tired. "Just heard there might be a place up here where a man could rest for a few days." Buck frowned. "Heard from who?" "Kid in town. Gas station in Miller's Creek. Said there was a barn up in the mountains, and the man who ran it didn't ask questions." The stranger lowered his hands slowly. "Name's Daniel Reeves. I'm not running from the law, if that's what you're worried about. Just trying to get my head straight." Buck studied him. The man's eyes were clear despite his rough appearance, and there was something in his bearing that suggested military training. "You're a veteran," Buck said. Daniel nodded. "Marines. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Got out 5 years ago." He pulled at his collar, and Buck caught a glimpse of dog tags underneath. "I've been having a hard time adjusting. PTSD. They've got fancy names for it now. Used to just call it shell shock." Daniel looked past Buck at the barn. "Look, I don't need charity. I can work. I'm good with my hands and I don't cause problems. Just need somewhere quiet for a while. Somewhere the world isn't so loud." Buck should have said no. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. Complications, responsibilities, other people's problems, bleeding into his solitude. But Thomas was already at the barn door, watching with interest. And Buck found himself thinking about what the boy had said. Either you're building something good, or you're tearing something down. 3 rules, Buck said finally. You work. You respect the space. And you don't bring trouble here. Can you follow those? Yes, sir. Stop calling me sir. Name's Buck. He gestured toward the barn. Come on. We'll get you warm and fed, then figure out what needs doing. Inside, Buck introduced Daniel to Thomas, and they shared a meal of venison stew. Buck had managed to take a deer the week before, and biscuits Thomas had learned to make. Daniel ate slowly, methodically, like a man who'd learned not to take anything for granted. After dinner, while Thomas cleaned up, Buck and Daniel sat by the fire. The veteran was quiet, staring into the flames, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "How'd you end up here?" Buck asked. "Miller's Creek is 40 miles down the mountain." "Walked." Daniel sipped his coffee. "Been walking for weeks, actually. Started in Denver, just heading north. No real destination, just away from the noise and the crowds and all the things that make my head spin." "What happened?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost mechanical. "I can't hold a job. Can't sleep through the night. Every loud noise sends me back there, and when I'm back there, I'm not safe to be around. Lost my wife, lost my apartment, lost pretty much everything that mattered. VA tries to help, but pills only do so much." He reached into his shirt and pulled out his dog tags, held them in his palm. The metal was worn, the stamping barely legible. "These are the only thing I got left that says who I used to be. Reeves, Daniel J., Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. That man died in a cave outside Kandahar, but somehow I'm still walking around wearing his name." Buck recognized the look in Daniel's eyes. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough, the look of a man who'd lost sight of who he was supposed to be. "You served your country," Buck said. "That counts for something." "Does it?" "Because it doesn't feel like it counted for much." Daniel tucked the tags back under his shirt. "I'm not suicidal, if that's what you're thinking. I'm just tired. Tired of fighting, tired of failing, tired of feeling like I don't fit anywhere." "You fit here," Thomas said quietly from across the barn. Both men turned to look at him. The boy was standing by the shelves they'd built, one hand on the wood. "This is a place for people who don't fit other places." "Right, Buck?" Buck hadn't thought of it that way, but the kid wasn't wrong. "Right," he said after a moment. "The work helps. Keeps your hands busy, keeps your mind from wandering too far. We're fixing up this barn, making it solid for winter. Could use another pair of hands." Daniel looked around at the barn, the repairs Buck and Thomas had made, the careful work visible in every corner. "You're doing good work here." "We're doing necessary work," Buck corrected. "There's a difference." Over the next few days, Daniel proved his worth. He was strong, despite his gaunt appearance, and he knew his way around tools. He helped Buck reinforce the roof, built additional bunks without being asked, and taught Thomas some basic carpentry techniques that Buck hadn't known. In the evenings, he was quiet, often sitting outside even in the cold. But he didn't complain, and he didn't cause trouble. A week after Daniel arrived, Buck was working alone outside when the veteran approached. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, "about what you're doing here." "I'm not doing anything," Buck said. "Just trying to get through winter." "That's not true." Daniel looked at the barn, at Thomas, visible through the window. "You're building something. Maybe you don't see it yet, but you are. A place where broken people can come and put themselves back together. A sanctuary." Buck shook his head. "I came here to be alone, Daniel. He gestured around. "This just happened. It's not a plan. The best things never are." Daniel pulled out his dog tags again, studied them. "I came here thinking I'd stay a few days and move on. But being here, working with my hands, sleeping without pills for the first time in months, it's helping. And I'm thinking maybe it could help others too. This isn't a charity operation, I know. It's better than that. It's honest work in exchange for peace. That's more valuable than any handout." Daniel met Buck's eyes. "Let me stay, Buck, not as a guest, but as part of this. Whatever this is becoming," Buck wanted to refuse. Wanted to explain that he wasn't equipped to run any kind of shelter or sanctuary. But he thought about Thomas, about how much the boy had changed in just a few weeks. Thought about Daniel, sleeping through the night, working with purpose. Thought about Silas's words, "A man builds something that lasts." "We'll see how winter goes," Buck said finally. "If you're still here in spring, we'll talk about what comes next." Daniel nodded, a small smile crossing his weathered face. Fair enough. That night, Buck lay in his bunk and listened to the sounds of the barn, Thomas's steady breathing, Daniel's occasional shifts on his bunk, the wind outside, the fire crackling. He pulled out Silas's watch, held it in the darkness. 3:47. Time stopped. But maybe, Buck thought, Time stopping for one person didn't mean it stopped for everyone. Maybe there were other ways to measure what mattered. By December, word had spread further than Buck had imagined possible. A woman arrived on foot, fleeing an abusive husband. Her name was Maria, and she carried nothing but a small backpack and bruises on her arms. She tried to hide. Buck gave her the bunk farthest from the door and made it clear to Daniel and Thomas that she was to be left alone unless she sought them out. After 3 days of silence, she started helping with the cooking, and slowly, carefully, she began to talk. Then came Robert, an older man who'd lost his small business and his home to debt. He was proud, formal even in his poverty, and he insisted on doing the heaviest work despite being close to 70. A week later, 2 teenage siblings arrived, a girl named Sophie and her younger brother Marcus, who'd run from a foster situation that had turned dangerous. They were scared, defensive, and Marcus wouldn't speak at all. Buck's barn was becoming something he'd never intended. Every new arrival meant adjustments, more bunks, more supplies, more careful management of resources. He made trips down the mountain every 2 weeks now, buying flour and beans and coffee with money that was running dangerously low. The barn was crowded. The solitude he'd sought completely gone, but something else was growing too. A kind of order, a community of broken people helping each other stay whole. One cold morning, Buck woke to find Daniel and Robert already up, working on expanding the barn. They'd started framing an addition to the south side without asking permission. Buck should have been angry, but instead he found himself joining them. And by noon, Thomas and even Maria were helping. "We need more space," Daniel explained during a break. "More people are coming, Buck. I heard talk in Miller's Creek when I went for supplies. There's a runaway network, people who know people, and your name is on it. This place is becoming known." "I didn't want to be known," Buck said. "I came here to disappear." "Too late for that." Daniel gestured at the work they'd done. "You built something that matters. Now you have to decide what to do with it." That afternoon, Buck rode alone to a small abandoned church he'd discovered 5 miles down the mountain. He'd passed it on one of his supply runs. A white clapboard building that had been locked up for years. The congregation dispersed, the structure slowly returning to the forest. The windows were still intact, though. Beautiful old stained glass panels showing simple scenes of mountains and rivers. Crafted by some long-dead believer who'd seen God in the landscape. Buck broke the lock on the side door and went inside. The interior was dusty but dry, the pews still standing in neat rows. At the far end, morning light streamed through the window above what had been the altar, a large panel showing a sunrise over mountains, the glass work intricate and lovely. Below it, a small brass plaque read, "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills." He spent an hour carefully removing the window, taking his time to avoid cracking the old glass. When he had it free, he wrapped it in blankets and secured it to Darla's saddle. It was heavy, awkward, but he managed the ride back without breaking it. Thomas was the first to see him return. "What's that?" "A window." Buck dismounted carefully. "Help me get it inside." They set it on the workbench, and Buck unwrapped it. The glass caught the afternoon light, throwing colors across the barn walls, blues and golds and deep greens. Everyone gathered to look. "It's beautiful," Maria whispered. "Where did it come from?" "Old church down the mountain. Abandoned. Seemed a shame to leave it there to rot." Buck studied the window, running his fingers along the lead lines that held the glass pieces together. "Thought we could install it here. Give this place some light. It's a church window," Robert observed. "You planning on making this a church?" "No," Buck shook his head. "But my grandfather used to say that any place where broken people find peace is holy ground, whether there's a preacher or not." Seemed fitting. They spent the next 2 days preparing the wall and installing the window in the east side of the barn, where the morning sun would hit it. Buck and Daniel did most of the structural work, cutting through the log wall and framing it properly. Thomas helped with the detail work, and even young Marcus got involved, handing up tools with silent efficiency. When they finally set the window in place and sealed it, the effect was immediate. The barn, which had always been functional and rough, suddenly had beauty. Every morning, when the sun rose, the window would glow, filling the space with colored light. It transformed everything. That evening they sat around the fire, all 7 of them now, and Maria surprised everyone by speaking more than Buck had ever heard from her. "My grandmother used to take me to church when I was little," she said, looking at the window. "She always said church wasn't about the building, it was about the people inside it. She said anywhere people gathered to help each other, that was church." "My unit had a saying," Daniel added. "Leave no one behind." Meant you looked after your people no matter what. This place feels like that, like we're looking after each other. Sophie, who'd been quiet since arriving, nodded. "And me and Marcus, we've been to a lot of places since our parents died. Foster homes, group facilities, relatives who didn't really want us. This is the first place that feels like maybe we could belong." Buck felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "This isn't permanent," he said. "You all know that. Winter is hard up here. Come spring, everyone needs to think about where they're really going." "Some of us are already where we're going," Robert said quietly. "This is it. This is the place we were looking for, even if we didn't know it." Buck stood, uncomfortable. "I'm going to check on Darla." He walked out into the cold night air, breathed deep. Daniel followed him out a few minutes later. "You're fighting it," he said. "Fighting what this is becoming." "I came here to get away from responsibility," Buck said. "From failure. From everything I couldn't fix or control. Now I've got 7 people depending on me, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing." "None of us do." Daniel leaned against the barn wall. "But we're doing it together, and that's what makes it work. You don't have to carry this alone, Buck. That's the whole point." Buck pulled out Silas's watch, looked at it in the moonlight. 3:47. "My grandfather built things, real things, solid things. I just let people into a barn. That's not the same, isn't it?" Daniel nodded toward the window, glowing faintly from the fire inside. "You're building a refuge, a sanctuary. That's as real and solid as anything your grandfather made. Maybe more so because what you're building saves lives," Buck wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he just stood in the cold, watching the colored light from the window play across the snow, and wondered when exactly he'd stopped running away and started building towards something. January brought the worst of winter. Snow fell almost daily, sometimes just flurries, sometimes storms that lasted 2 days and buried the barn up to the windows. They were snowed in more often than not, but they'd prepared well. The food stores held, the firewood lasted, and the barn stayed warm even when the wind howled through the pines. The routine they'd established helped everyone cope with the close quarters. Buck woke everyone before dawn, and they started the day with work. Someone always needed to clear snow, tend the fire, prepare meals, or work on the endless repairs and improvements the barn required. After breakfast, Daniel led what he called training exercises, mostly just calisthenics and stretches, but it gave people structure and kept them from going stir-crazy in the confined space. Afternoons were for individual projects or rest. Evenings belonged to the fire and conversation. It was during one of those evening gatherings that Sophie asked Buck the question he'd been avoiding. "You never talk about yourself," she said. "We all know why we're here, but we don't know anything about you. Why did you come to the mountain?" Buck was cleaning Silas's tools, a task he did often, keeping them oiled and sharp. He didn't look up. "Same reason as everyone else. Nowhere else to go." "That's not an answer," Thomas said. The boy had become more confident over the months, more willing to speak his mind. "You had a ranch, a life. What happened?" Buck set down the chisel he'd been working on. They all waited, watching him in the firelight. Maria was mending a shirt. Robert was whittling a piece of wood. The children were playing a quiet card game. Daniel sat with his back against his bunk, eyes steady on Buck. "It's not a happy story," Buck said finally. "None of ours are," Maria replied. "That's why we're here." Buck reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. From the billfold, he extracted a photograph, creased and worn from years of carrying. He looked at it for a moment, then passed it to Sophie. "That's my wife, Ellen, and that's our daughter, Sarah, taken maybe 20 years ago." The photograph made its way around the circle. Ellen was smiling, her arm around Sarah, who must have been in her 20s at the time. They were standing in front of the ranch house, mountains visible in the background. It was a picture of happiness, of a family intact. "Your wife is beautiful," Maria said softly. "She passed 8 years ago, cancer." Buck took the photograph back, studied it. "We had 37 good years together. That's more than a lot of people get. Sarah, she lives in Denver now. Married, successful. We talk maybe once a month. She wanted me to sell the ranch after Ellen died, move to the city to be closer to her. I refused. Thought I needed to keep the place going, honor all the work Ellen and I had put in." "What happened to the ranch?" Robert asked. "Cattle prices dropped. Then the drought hit. Then I made some bad investments trying to keep things afloat." Buck folded the photograph carefully and put it back in his wallet. "Bank held the note. When I couldn't make payments, they took it all. House, land, livestock, everything. I'm sorry," Sophie said. "Don't be. I made my choices. Some of them were good, some weren't. In the end, the math didn't work out in my favor." Buck picked up the chisel again, ran his thumb along the edge. "The morning they came to take it, I realized I'd spent 40 years building something I thought mattered, and it all came down to paper and numbers and signatures. Didn't seem real, but it was real," Thomas said. "The life you had there, that was real. The numbers were just the ending, not the whole story." Buck looked at the boy, surprised by the insight. "Maybe, but when you lose everything, it's hard to remember the good parts. All you can see is the failure." "Is that why you came here?" Daniel asked. "To hide from the failure?" "At first, yes." Buck set down the tool. "My grandfather built this barn. He was a logger, worked these mountains for 30 years, built solid things that lasted. I thought if I came here, maybe I could figure out what I did wrong. Or maybe just disappear where nobody would have to look at me and remember what I'd lost. But then we showed up," Thomas said with a small smile. "Yeah, then you showed up." Buck allowed himself a slight smile in return. "One runaway kid who needed a place to sleep. Then a veteran who couldn't find peace. Then all the rest of you. I kept thinking you'd all move on, and I could get back to my solitude." "But we didn't move on," Maria said. "No, you didn't. And somewhere along the way, I stopped wanting you to." Buck looked around the barn, at the bunks they'd built, the shelves, the stained glass window that caught the firelight, the faces of people who'd become more than strangers. "My grandfather used to say that a man builds something that lasts. I thought he meant buildings, structures, physical things. Maybe he meant something else. Community," Robert said. "He meant building community. Legacy," Daniel added. "Building something that continues after you're gone. Purpose," Sophie said quietly. "Building a life that means something." Buck pulled out Silas's pocket watch, held it so everyone could see. "This watch belonged to my grandfather. It stopped at 3:47, the moment he died. I've carried it ever since, and for a long time I thought it was a reminder that time runs out, that everything ends." He turned the watch over, showed them the inscription on the back. "Builder, that's what he was. That's what he wanted to be remembered as. That's what you are too," Thomas said. "You're building something here, Buck, something that matters." Buck looked at the watch for a long moment, then closed his fist around it. "My daughter called me 3 weeks ago. I hiked down to Miller's Creek to use the phone at the gas station. She wanted to know how I was doing, if I needed anything. I told her I was fine, that I'd found something to do with my time. She said I sounded different, better, like maybe I'd found something I'd been looking for. Had you?" Maria asked. Buck met her eyes. "I think so. I just didn't know I was looking for it until I found it." The fire crackled, sending sparks up toward the ceiling. Outside, snow had started falling again, soft and steady. Inside, 7 people sat in the warmth and light, brought together by circumstance and need, held together by something harder to name. "Tell us about Ellen," Sophie said after a while. "What was she like?" And Buck, who'd spent months trying to forget, found himself remembering instead. He told them about Ellen's laugh, about how she could calm any animal with just her voice, about the garden she'd kept that produced more vegetables than 2 people could ever eat. He told them about Sarah learning to ride, about Christmas mornings, about the ordinary moments that had made up an extraordinary life. And as he talked, something in Buck's chest loosened. Some knot of grief and shame and regret that he'd been carrying since the morning the bank came. The stories poured out, and the others listened. And Buck realized that this sharing of pain and memory and hope, this was what building really meant. Not structures made of wood and stone, but connections made of trust and time. The lawman arrived on a clear February morning. Buck was outside splitting wood when he heard the sound of a snowmobile coming up the trail. He set down his axe and waited, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt on his hip. The machine emerged from the trees, and Buck recognized the rider, Sheriff Tom Hendricks from Miller's Creek, a man Buck had known for 20 years. Tom cut the engine and pulled off his helmet, his expression serious. "Buck," Tom said, dismounting. "We need to talk. Coffee's on inside." Buck gestured toward the barn. "Come on." Inside, the others looked up nervously as the sheriff entered. Tom nodded to them, his eyes taking in the expanded space, the bunks, the stained-glass window, the obvious signs of habitation. Buck poured coffee and led Tom to the far end of the barn, away from the others but not out of sight. "You've been busy," Tom said, sipping his coffee, "staying occupied." Buck leaned against the wall. "What brings you all the way up here, Tom?" The sheriff reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "This came through my office 3 days ago. Legal matter. Concerns this property." He handed the paper to Buck. Buck unfolded it, read slowly. It was a property deed claim, filed by a law firm in Denver on behalf of someone named James Tillman. The claim stated that this land, 40 acres including the barn, had been improperly transferred after Silas Tillman's death, and that the rightful heir was seeking to reclaim it. At the bottom was a court order requiring Buck to vacate the premises within 30 days, or face forcible removal. "James Tillman," Buck said quietly. "That's my cousin. Silas's grandson through his other son. You know him." "Haven't seen him in 30 years. He went east after college, became some kind of businessman. Never came back, never had any interest in the family or the land." Buck read through the document again. "Silas left this property to me. It was in his will. According to this, there was a problem with the will. Something about it not being properly witnessed or filed." Tom finished his coffee. "I'm not a lawyer, Buck, but this looks legitimate enough that a judge issued the order. You'll need to respond through legal channels." "I don't have money for lawyers, Tom. I don't have money for anything." Buck folded the paper. "Besides, we both know how this ends. Rich man from the city with lawyers versus broke cowboy living in a barn. That's not a fair fight. Maybe not. But you can't just ignore it." Tom looked around the barn again. "What's going on here, Buck?" "Word around town is you're running some kind of refuge. Taking in runaways and homeless people." "I'm not running anything. People showed up needing help. I didn't turn them away." "How many people?" "7, including me." Tom rubbed his face. "Buck, I've known you a long time. You're a good man. But this," he gestured around, "this could be a problem. You got permits? Any kind of legal structure? What if something happens to one of these people?" "Nothing's going to happen. You don't know that. And if it does, you're liable. All of you are." Tom lowered his voice. "Look, I get what you're trying to do. It's admirable. But you're exposing yourself to all kinds of risk here. Legal risk, financial risk. We don't have anything, Tom. What are they going to take?" Buck's voice was harder now. "These people have nowhere else. If I kick them out because of legal risk, what happens to them? That's not your responsibility." "Maybe not, but it's my choice." Buck looked at the others, who were trying not to appear like they were listening. "We're not hurting anyone. We're just trying to survive winter." Tom sighed. "I'm not here to shut you down, Buck. I'm here because the law requires me to serve you that document. What you do with it is up to you. But I'd advise you to talk to a lawyer. Maybe there's a way to fight this claim. And if there isn't, then you've got 30 days to figure out where you're going." Tom stood, set his cup down. "I'm sorry, Buck. I really am." After Tom left, Buck sat alone at the workbench, the deed claim spread out in front of him. The others gave him space, understanding that whatever had just happened was serious. Only Daniel approached after an hour, sitting down across from Buck. "Bad news." Daniel asked. "The worst." "This land, the barn, everything, it's being claimed by my cousin. A man I haven't seen in decades who never gave a damn about this place until now. Buck tapped the paper. He says the deed wasn't properly transferred when my grandfather died. Says it should have gone to him. Can he do that? With enough lawyers you can do anything. Buck folded the paper. We have 30 days to vacate. Daniel absorbed this. What are you going to do? I don't know. Buck walked to the window with the stained glass. The afternoon sun was hitting it, casting colors across the floor. I came here to hide. Built this up because people needed it. Now someone's going to take it all away, and everyone here goes back to having nothing. There has to be something we can do. Like what? I don't have money to fight this. I barely have money to feed everyone. Buck turned back. Maybe this is how it ends. Maybe I was never meant to build anything that lasted. That evening, Buck gathered everyone and explained the situation. He was direct, matter-of-fact, trying to soften nothing. When he finished, the barn was silent. So we have to leave, Maria said finally. I have to leave. This is my problem, not yours. If you leave, we all leave, Thomas said. This place exists because you made it. Without you, it's just a barn. Where will we go? Sophie asked, her voice small. Marcus, beside her, looked terrified. I don't know yet. Buck felt the weight of responsibility crushing down. But we'll figure something out. Robert stood, walked to his bunk, and returned with a small metal box. He opened it, revealing a stack of cash, not a fortune, but more than Buck had expected. I've been saving, Robert said, from before I lost everything. This is maybe $3,000. It's yours. To fight this. I can't take your money. You can and you will. Robert's voice was firm. You gave me a place when I had nothing. This is how I pay that debt. Maria went to her bag, pulled out a small envelope. I've been working, doing sewing for people down in Miller's Creek. Took orders last time Daniel went for supplies. It's not much, but add it to Robert's. One by one, the others came forward. Daniel had money from an odd job. Sophie had saved from before they ran. Even Thomas, who'd arrived with nothing, had a small amount he'd earned doing chores for a farmer. Together, it amounted to almost $5,000. Buck stared at the money on the table, overwhelmed. You need this, for when you leave here, we need this to stay here, Daniel interrupted. This place saved us, Buck, all of us. Now it's our turn to save it. Buck picked up the envelope with the deed claim, looked at it again. At the bottom was the name of the law firm, Cooper and Associates, Denver, and then something caught his eye, a detail he'd missed before. There was a secondary claim attached, a codicil that stated the property had additional value beyond the land itself. It mentioned mineral rights, water rights, and potential development. He doesn't want the barn, Buck said slowly. He wants what's under it, or around it. What do you mean? Daniel asked. My cousin is a developer. He doesn't care about family history or legacy. He cares about profit. Buck spread the document out. If he's going through all this trouble to claim this land, there's something here worth more than sentiment. Can we use that? Thomas asked. Maybe. Buck's mind was working now, turning over possibilities. If he wants the land for development, there might be a way to block it. Environmental protections, historical preservation, something. He looked at the money on the table. But we'll need help. Someone who knows law and land rights. I know someone, Maria said quietly. Everyone turned to her. Before my husband, I worked for a legal aid office. There was a lawyer there, Jennifer Matthews. She specialized in land rights and helped indigenous communities fight developers. If I can get a message to her, do it, Buck said. Use whatever it takes. We've got 30 days to figure this out, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let this place go without a fight. That night, Buck couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, Silas's watch in his hand, thinking about legacy and purpose and the strange twists of fate that had brought him here. He'd come to this mountain to escape failure, and now he was facing it again, but this time he wasn't alone. This time he had people who believed the fight was worth having. 3:47, the watch read. Time stopped. But maybe, Buck thought, it was time to start it moving again. Jennifer Matthews arrived 5 days later, driving a rugged jeep up the trail that was barely passable even with chains. She was in her 40s, with short grey hair and sharp eyes that assessed everything. Maria greeted her like an old friend, and Buck could see the relief in Maria's face at having someone there who might actually help. They gathered around the table Buck had built, the deed claim spread out between them. Jennifer read through it carefully, making notes, asking questions. When she finished, she looked up at Buck with an expression that was neither encouraging nor discouraging. "It's complicated," she said. "Your cousin has a legitimate claim that the original will was improperly executed. The witnesses weren't who they needed to be, and the filing was delayed past the legal deadline. That creates an opening for him to challenge the transfer." "So I don't have a legal right to be here," Buck said. "Not quite. There are counter-arguments, adverse possession for one. You've been using and improving the property for months, but that takes years to establish fully. The stronger argument is what you noticed, his motivation. If we can prove he's acting in bad faith, seeking the land for commercial development that would harm the environment or violate zoning, we might be able to block the transfer." "How do we prove that?" Daniel asked. "Research. Investigation. Finding out exactly what he's planning." Jennifer pulled out her laptop. "I've already started. Your cousin, James Tillman, owns a development company called Tillman Enterprises. They specialize in resort properties in mountain areas. 6 months ago, they filed exploratory permits for a property matching this location's description." She turned the laptop around, showing them satellite images marked with overlays. "They want to build a luxury resort, cabins, a main lodge, spa facilities. They're calling it Timber Ridge Retreat. They estimate it could generate $15 million in annual revenue once operational." Buck stared at the images. The barn was just a small square on the map, but the proposed development covered the entire 40 acres and more. They'd destroy everything. That's the plan. And under normal circumstances, they'd have the right to do it. But Jennifer pulled up another document. "This land sits on the edge of a protected watershed. There are endangered species here, including lynx and wolverine. If we can document their presence and prove the development would harm them, we can tie this up in environmental review for years." "Will that be enough?" Maria asked. "It might be, or..." Jennifer looked at Buck. "There's another option. Do you have your grandfather's original deed, the one that transferred the property to him in the first place?" "I might." Buck went to his bunk and pulled out the wooden box that held his important papers. Inside was a stack of documents, his birth certificate, his marriage license, Ellen's death certificate, and underneath, yellowed with age, was a folded piece of paper. He brought it back to the table. Jennifer unfolded it carefully. It was a land deed dated 1952, transferring 40 acres from the U.S. Forest Service to Silas Tillman. The language was formal, full of legal descriptions of boundaries and easements. But at the bottom, there was a clause Jennifer's finger stopped on. "This is it," she said. "This is what we need." "What?" Buck leaned closer. "Read this clause. Said property to be held in perpetuity by Silas Tillman and his heirs, with the provision that the land shall not be subdivided or commercially developed and shall remain in use for agricultural, residential, or conservation purposes only. Violation of this provision shall result in the property reverting to public trust." Buck read the words twice. "I don't understand. What does that mean?" "It means your grandfather didn't just own this land. He owned it with restrictions. The government gave him the land cheap because he agreed to keep it undeveloped. That restriction passes to all future owners." Jennifer smiled. "Your cousin can claim ownership all he wants, but the moment he tries to develop it, he loses it completely. The land goes back to the Forest Service." "So we can stop him," Thomas said. "We can, but there's a catch." Jennifer's smile faded. "If Buck doesn't have clear title, and James does get the property, he might try to argue the restriction is invalid. We need to establish Buck's rightful ownership first, which brings us back to the will problem." What if we don't fight the will? Robert said suddenly. Everyone turned to him. What if we accept that the will was improper, but argue for Buck's right to the land on other grounds? Jennifer considered this. That's interesting. What grounds? Adverse possession, like you said. But also, Buck's been improving the property, maintaining it, using it for exactly the purpose the original deed specified. Residential and conservation. He's fulfilling the terms of the restriction better than anyone else could. That might work, Jennifer said slowly. But we'd need to document everything Buck's done. Show clear evidence of continuous occupation and improvement. We've been keeping records, Daniel said. He went to a shelf and pulled down a notebook. I started this in January. Every repair we made, every person who arrived, every supply run. It's all here. Jennifer took the notebook, flipped through it. Her expression shifted to something like amazement. This is good. This is really good. You've essentially been running a charitable operation, providing shelter, rehabilitation, community support, all within the legal use of the property. We didn't think of it like that, Buck said. We were just helping people. That's even better. It shows genuine use, not strategic positioning. Jennifer closed the notebook. Here's what I think we should do. We file a response to the claim that does three things. First, we acknowledge the will problem, but assert Buck's right through adverse possession and adherence to the deed restrictions. Second, we document the endangered species and watershed issues that would prevent development. Third, we demonstrate the current use as a conservation and charitable operation that fulfills the property's intended purpose. Will a judge accept that? Maria asked. I don't know, but it's our best shot. Jennifer looked at Buck. There's something else you should know. I contacted James Tillman's lawyers, told them I was representing you. They offered a settlement. What kind of settlement? $50,000 for you to vacate immediately and sign over any claim to the property. The barn was silent. $50,000 was more money than Buck had seen in years. It would set him up, maybe let him start over somewhere else. He looked around at the faces watching him. Thomas, Daniel, Maria, Robert, Sophie, Marcus. 7 people who'd become family, who'd pooled their money to fight for a place that had saved them. Tell them no, Buck said. Buck, Jennifer began, tell them no. This land isn't mine to sell. It was my grandfather's, and he wanted it kept the way it is. He built this barn with his own hands because he believed in making something that would last. I'm not going to let it get torn down for condos and spa treatments. Even if you lose everything? Jennifer asked. I've already lost everything once. Didn't kill me. Buck picked up the old deed, held it carefully. My grandfather wrote something on the back of his pocket watch. Just one word, builder. That's what he was. That's what I'm trying to be. You don't build things by selling them to the highest bidder. Jennifer studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. I'll file the response. But Buck, you need to understand, this is going to get ugly. They'll fight hard. They'll try to discredit everything you've done here. And even if we win, it might take years. Then we'll take years. Buck looked at the others. If you all want to stay and see this through, we're staying, Daniel said. The others nodded in agreement. Then I guess we're in this together. Buck stood, walked to the stained glass window. The late afternoon sun was making it glow. What do we need to do? Jennifer pulled out a legal pad. We need documentation, lots of it. Photographs of every improvement you've made to the barn. Testimony from everyone here about why they came and what this place means to them. Evidence of the endangered species. We'll need to bring in a wildlife biologist. Financial records showing this is a charitable operation, not a business. Character witnesses from town who can speak to Buck's integrity and intent. I can help with the wildlife survey, Robert said. I used to work for Fish and Wildlife before I retired. I'll organize the testimonies, Maria offered. Make sure everyone's story is documented properly. I can take photographs, Sophie said. I've got a decent camera in my bag. And I'll contact people in town, Daniel added. See who will speak for Buck. Buck felt something swelling in his chest, a mix of gratitude and fear and determination. When do we start? Now, Jennifer said. The hearing is in 3 weeks. That's not a lot of time, but if we work hard and get lucky, we might just pull this off. Over the next 3 weeks, the barn became a command center. They worked dawn to dusk, gathering evidence, documenting every detail, building their case. Robert surveyed the surrounding forest and found tracks of lynx, documented den sites, mapped migration patterns. Sophie photographed every inch of the barn, showing the craftsmanship and care that had gone into the restoration. Maria interviewed everyone, recording their stories, creating a narrative of redemption and community. Daniel made 3 trips to town, talking to Ed at the hardware store, Louisa at the diner, Tom the sheriff, and a dozen others. Most agreed to testify on Buck's behalf. A few were skeptical, worried about legal exposure or just uncomfortable with what Buck had created. But most understood that what was happening in the barn mattered. Buck spent his time working with Jennifer, going over every detail of his grandfather's history, the land's history, and his own relationship to the property. They practiced his testimony until he could deliver it clearly and calmly, even when Jennifer played devil's advocate and asked the hard questions James's lawyers would certainly ask. At night, exhausted, Buck would sit by the fire and pull out Silas's watch. 3:47. Time stopped, but around him, time was very much in motion. People working, planning, fighting for something that mattered, building something that would last. On the morning they were set to leave for the courthouse in Miller's Creek, Buck stood outside the barn and looked at what they'd created. The structure was solid now, weather-tight and strong. The addition they'd built had expanded the space. The stained glass window caught the morning light. Smoke rose from the chimney into the clear mountain air. This was worth fighting for. Whatever came next, Buck knew that much was true. The courthouse in Miller's Creek was a modest building, red brick with white trim, built in the 1950s when the town had bigger ambitions. Buck walked in wearing the only suit he owned. Borrowed boots shined to a dull gloss, and a tie that Thomas had helped him knot that morning. Behind him came Daniel, Maria, Robert, and Jennifer. The teenagers had stayed at the barn. Sophie wanted to be there, but Jennifer advised that minors in the courtroom could complicate things. James Tillman was already seated at the plaintiff's table with his lawyers, 3 of them, all wearing expensive suits and carrying leather briefcases. James was in his late 60s, trim and tanned, in a way that spoke of gym memberships and winter vacations. He didn't look at Buck when they entered. The judge was a woman named Helen Morrison, grey-haired and stern-faced, with a reputation for fairness but no patience for nonsense. She called the hearing to order and asked both sides to present their opening statements. James's lead attorney went first. His name was Carlson, and he was smooth, confident, and prepared. He laid out the case methodically, the improperly executed will, the clear line of inheritance that should have passed the property to James, the legal precedent supporting their claim. He painted Buck as well-meaning, but ultimately trespassing on property that wasn't his. "Your Honor," Carlson said, "this isn't about condemning Mr. Buck Tillman's charitable impulses. It's about property rights and legal succession. My client has a legitimate claim to land that was improperly transferred. We're simply asking the court to correct that error and restore the property to its rightful owner." Jennifer stood for the defense. She was less polished than Carlson, but more direct. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about property rights, specifically the rights established when the land was originally transferred from public ownership. The deed contains explicit restrictions that prevent commercial development. Mr. James Tillman's company has already filed exploratory permits for a resort development on this very property. He's not seeking to restore family land. He's seeking to profit from it in violation of the deed's terms." She placed a folder on the judge's bench. "We've documented endangered species on the property, watershed concerns, and zoning issues that would prevent any such development. More importantly, Buck Tillman has been maintaining and improving the property in exact accordance with the deed's restrictions. He's fulfilled the land's intended purpose better than anyone." Judge Morrison reviewed the documents, her expression unreadable. "We'll hear testimony. Mr. Carlson, call your first witness." The next 2 hours were grueling. James took the stand and spoke about family history, about his memories of visiting Silas as a child, about how he'd always understood the land would come to him as the eldest grandson. He was polished and sympathetic, painting a picture of a family legacy that had been stolen through bureaucratic error. Carlson then called a handwriting expert who testified that the signatures on Silas's will appeared authentic, but that the witnesses' signatures couldn't be verified, raising questions about the document's validity. When Jennifer's turn came, she called Robert first. The old man testified about the wildlife he'd documented, showing photographs of lynx tracks, den sites, and migration patterns. He explained how the proposed development would destroy critical habitat for species that were already struggling. Then Maria took the stand and spoke about what the barn had meant to her, a place of safety when she'd fled violence, a community that had helped her heal. Her testimony was emotional but controlled, and Buck could see the judge listening carefully. Daniel testified next, describing his PTSD and how the structure and purpose of the barn had given him back a sense of meaning. He was calm, direct, and compelling. Finally, Jennifer called Buck. He walked to the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Jennifer led him through the basic facts, his relationship to Silas, his arrival at the barn, the improvements he'd made. Then she asked the critical question, "Mr. Tillman, why did you come to this property?" Buck thought about lying, about making it sound noble or planned, but he'd promised to tell the truth. "I came here to hide," he said. "I'd lost everything, my ranch, my wife, my sense of who I was. The barn was the last place I could think to go where nobody would bother me. I planned to disappear, but you didn't disappear. No, people found me, needed help. At first, I wanted them gone. But then I started to understand what my grandfather built wasn't just a barn. It was a place where broken things could be mended, including me." Jennifer walked to her table and picked up an envelope, yellowed with age. "Your Honor, this morning I was going through some documents from Silas Tillman's estate. I found something that was never delivered to Buck Tillman, a letter Silas wrote shortly before his death." Carlson stood. "Objection! We haven't seen this document." It was in the county records," Jennifer interrupted. "Filed with Silas's will. Overlooked until now." She handed copies to the judge and to Carlson. "I'd like to enter it as evidence and have Mr. Tillman read it." Judge Morrison examined the letter, then nodded. "I'll allow it. Mr. Tillman, please read the letter aloud." Buck took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single page written in Silas's distinctive handwriting. He recognized it immediately, the same careful script from the notations on the carpenter's ruler. Buck cleared his throat and began to read. "Dear Buck, if you're reading this, I've gone on ahead, and you've found your way to the barn, like I hoped you would. I'm writing this because there are things I need to say that I never got around to saying when I was still drawing breath. I built that barn with my own hands over 2 summers, in 1955 and 1956. Every beam, every joint, every shingle. It was hard work, the kind that leaves you so tired you can barely move, but it was good work. The kind that means something. I built it to last, because I believed that what a man builds with his own hands becomes part of the land, part of the story of a place. I'm leaving the land to you, Buck, not because you're the oldest or the closest, but because you understand what it means to build something. I've watched you on your ranch all these years, working that hard ground, raising cattle, making a life with Ellen. You know what it takes to stick with something even when it's difficult. That's what this land needs. Someone who'll stick with it. I put restrictions on this land when I got it from the government. No development, no subdividing, just living and working and letting the wild things be wild. The government man thought I was foolish, turning down the chance to sell it off for profit someday. But I told him some things matter more than profit. Some places need to stay the way God made them. The barn is yours now, Buck. Do with it what seems right. Maybe you'll use it for storage. Maybe you'll tear it down. Maybe you'll find some other purpose for it that I never imagined. But whatever you do, remember this. A man builds something that lasts, not for himself, but for the people who come after. We're all just passing through. What matters is what we leave behind. I'm proud of you, grandson. Always have been. Now go build something that matters. Your grandfather, Silas," Buck's voice broke on the last words. He lowered the letter, unable to look up at the courtroom. The silence was profound. Judge Morrison was the first to speak. "Thank you, Mr. Tillman." She looked at both attorneys. "I'd like to take a short recess to review all the evidence." 30 minutes. The courtroom emptied slowly. Buck walked outside with Jennifer and the others. He felt hollowed out, the emotion of reading his grandfather's words still echoing in his chest. "That was powerful," Jennifer said quietly. The judge was moved. "I could see it." "Does it change anything legally?" Daniel asked. "Maybe. It establishes Silas's clear intent that Buck was his chosen heir, that the restrictions on the land were central to Silas's wishes. Combined with everything else, it strengthens our case. But Buck wasn't thinking about the legal arguments. He was thinking about his grandfather, sitting on his porch in the days before his death, writing that letter with arthritic hands because he wanted to make sure Buck understood. Not just about the land, but about legacy, about purpose, about building things that mattered. "He knew," Buck said. "He knew I'd need this place someday. Knew I'd come here when everything else fell apart. He knew you," Maria said gently. "That's what grandparents do." When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Morrison was already at the bench, her expression composed. Everyone took their seats. Buck felt his heart hammering. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony," Judge Morrison began. "This is a complex case involving property rights, estate law, environmental regulations, and competing claims of inheritance. But at its core, it's about something simpler, intent and purpose. Silas Tillman's intent is clear from both the deed restrictions and his letter. He wanted this land preserved and used for living, not for commercial development. Buck Tillman has fulfilled that intent through his occupancy and improvements to the property. The wildlife documentation and watershed concerns further support the deed's restrictions against development. As for the will's validity, I find that while there were procedural errors, the letter establishes clear testamentary intent. Combined with Buck Tillman's adverse possession claim, supported by documented improvements and continuous occupancy, I find sufficient grounds to recognize his claim to the property." Buck's breath caught. Beside him, Jennifer squeezed his arm. "However," the judge continued, and Buck's hope faltered, "I'm also cognizant of James Tillman's family connection and his initial good faith claim. Therefore, I'm issuing a split ruling. The property will remain with Buck Tillman, subject to the original deed restrictions. James Tillman is hereby barred from any development plans for the property. But," she looked at Buck, "Mr. Tillman, you will need to formalize the operation you've established. This can't remain an informal arrangement. You'll need to establish a non-profit entity, obtain proper permits, and operate within county regulations for a residential facility." Jennifer stood. "Your Honor, we're prepared to file for non-profit status immediately. See that you do. I'm giving you 6 months to get your paperwork in order. If you fail to do so, we'll revisit the question of ownership." Judge Morrison struck her gavel. "This court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. James Tillman stood abruptly and walked out without looking at Buck. His lawyers gathered their materials in tight-lipped silence. Buck sat motionless, trying to process what had just happened. They'd won. Not completely, not perfectly, but they'd won. "Buck," Jennifer said, pulling him to his feet. "We did it. The barn is yours." Daniel clapped him on the back. Maria was crying and smiling at the same time. Robert shook his hand with grave dignity. And Buck, who'd come to that mountain to disappear, found himself surrounded by people who'd helped him build something that would last. Spring came to the high country slowly, grudgingly, the snow retreating up the mountain 1 inch at a time. By late April, the meadow below the barn was green again, and the creek ran high with snowmelt. Wildflowers appeared in patches of purple and gold, and the forest came alive with birdsong and the movement of animals emerging from their winter sleep. Buck stood outside the barn on a morning so clear it hurt to look at the sky. Behind him, the structure stood solid and expanded. They'd added another room over the winter, built a proper kitchen, installed a generator system powered by the creek. The stained glass window caught the morning light, throwing colors across the new wooden sign that Daniel had carved and mounted beside the door. Tillman Sanctuary. Below that, in smaller letters, a place to rebuild. The non-profit paperwork had taken 4 months to complete, but Jennifer had guided them through it. They were official now, a registered charitable organization providing temporary housing and support services to individuals in crisis. The county had inspected and approved. They had insurance, liability protection, and a board of directors consisting of Buck, Jennifer, and 3 community members from Miller's Creek. 12 people lived at the sanctuary now. Thomas was still there, working as Buck's assistant and studying for his GED. Daniel had become the operations manager, handling logistics and coordinating the work schedule. Maria ran the kitchen and managed supplies. Robert led the conservation efforts, monitoring the wildlife and maintaining the forest trails they'd built. Sophie and Marcus had left in March, reunited with an aunt in Oregon who'd proven safe and caring. But they wrote every week. New people had arrived over the winter, a woman fleeing addiction, a couple who'd lost their home to medical debt, a young veteran who'd heard about the place from Daniel. Each one came broken in some way, and each one found work to do, purpose to pursue. Not everyone stayed. Some healed and moved on, which Buck had learned to accept. The sanctuary wasn't meant to be forever. It was meant to be a bridge between falling and standing again. Buck walked down to the creek, following the trail they'd worn smooth with use. At the water's edge, he pulled out Silas's pocket watch, but now it looked different. He'd taken it to a jeweler in Miller's Creek a month ago, an old man who specialized in antique repairs. The crystal was new, the case polished, and when Buck opened it, the hands were moving. It showed the correct time, 6:15 in the morning. The jeweler had asked if Buck was sure he wanted it repaired. "Sometimes the stop time means something," the old man had said. "It does," Buck had replied. "But I think it's time for it to mean something different now." He watched the second hand sweep smoothly around the dial. Time moving forward again, not forgetting the past, but not frozen in it either, footsteps on the trail behind him. Buck turned to see Thomas approaching, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The boy, young man now really, had grown in the months since he'd arrived. Taller, stronger, more confident. He handed Buck a cup and sat on a fallen log beside the creek. "Jennifer called," Thomas said. "Another referral. Woman from Wyoming with 2 kids. Needs a place for a few months while she gets back on her feet." "We have the space," Buck said. "We do now. But Buck, we're at capacity. If we keep growing, we'll need to expand again or start turning people away." Buck sipped his coffee, thinking. "What do you think we should do?" "I think we should expand. There's room to build another structure, maybe closer to the creek. We could house families separately, give them more privacy." Thomas smiled slightly. "I've been working on some designs. Nothing fancy, but functional." "Show me later." Buck watched the water flow past, constant and unchanging. "You know, when I came here, I thought I was done. Done building, done trying, done caring about anything beyond making it through the next day. I thought the rest of my life would just be waiting for it to end. What changed? You showed up. Then Daniel, then everyone else." Buck turned the watch over in his hand. "My grandfather told me a man builds something that lasts. I thought he meant structures, physical things. But maybe what lasts isn't the wood and stone. Maybe it's the connections we make, the people we help, the way we change each other." "The barn will last too," Thomas said. "It's built solid. The barn will last. But long after it's gone, the people who passed through here will still be out in the world, building their own lives, maybe helping others the way they were helped. That's what really lasts." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the creek, drinking coffee. Finally, Thomas stood. "I should start breakfast. People will be up soon." Buck nodded, but stayed by the creek a little longer. He thought about Ellen, about Sarah, about the ranch he'd lost, and the life that had come before. It hurt less now, those memories. They'd become part of the story instead of the whole story. He thought about Silas, about the letter, about the legacy of building things that mattered. His phone buzzed. He kept it charged now, stayed connected. A text from Sarah. "Dad, Marcus and I are planning to visit next month. Want to see what you've built. Proud of you. Buck smiled, typed back a simple reply. Come any time. Plenty of room. He stood, stretched his back, and started up the trail toward the barn. Smoke was rising from the chimney now, and he could hear voices inside, people waking up, starting their day. There was work to do. There was always work to do. Repairs to make, meals to prepare, people to help, problems to solve. But it was good work, the kind that meant something, the kind that lasted. Buck reached the barn door and paused, looked back at the mountain rising behind them, at the forest and the sky and the vast stretch of wilderness that Silas had loved. Then he looked at the sign Daniel had carved, Tillman's Sanctuary, a place to rebuild. He pulled out the watch one more time, checked it. 6:30, time moving forward. Buck smiled, put the watch back in his pocket, and walked inside to start the day.